All right, so I'm just going to get right into it. Welcome to the game of grading. We're going to do a couple of micro talks and then answer some questions. So my name is Lindsay Grace. I'm Knight Chair of Interactive Media at the University of Miami. I've had the pleasure of teaching at a variety of institutions and developing programs there. So I was the co-director of the Game Center at Miami University, founder of American University's Game Lab, and I'm currently Knight Chair in the School of Communications at the University of Miami. In my history, I've taught more than 90 class sections, had more than 12 new classes created, and I've also created or co-created 4 or 5 different programs in games. Sorry for the sore throat. So this includes certificates, undergraduate degrees, and graduate degrees, both MFA and MS. And I love assessment. And I'm going to say I love assessment mostly. And of course, you're all thinking, assessment? Really? He must be lying. But honestly, I think one of the cool things that we get to do as faculty is construct interesting assessments. So one of the oddities about being in higher education is that people often ask you to assess, but don't necessarily tell you how to do it. The assumption is that you just do what you've seen done before. So I'm going to give you some recommendations. I'm going to start with don't start from the bottom, which is, I'll sort of explain this. Instead, I encourage you to start from the top. So starting from the top basically means starting with program outcomes, then course outcomes, and assignment outcomes. So you kind of ask these questions like, what kind of students do you want to foster and produce at the program level, and also what are the key foci for your education? And you ask those same questions, changing the scope. So at the course outcomes level, you're saying the same thing. What kind of students do I want to produce in this class? And what are my key foci for this particular class? And likewise, for assignments, it's just narrowing that scope, but asking the same key questions. So you're now asking, what are the key foci within your assignments? Sort of starting from the top is really just about asking the same questions at each level and using them to inform each other. So these are the questions again. You're just changing that limit. What are the key foci at your top level education, then at your class, and then at your assignment? So I kind of envision starting from the top looking a lot like this. Program outcomes precipitate to course outcomes precipitate to specific assignments, and we assess those assignments. What's nice about doing it this way is that you can start to identify things like, we don't have a class to actually assess a specific program outcome. Likewise, you could look at courses and start to say, wait a minute, this course is supposed to teach an outcome, but we don't actually have an assignment linked to it. Likewise, you can actually look at some of your assignments and say, wow, they don't really connect with the program or course outcomes the way we expected. It seems like it's superfluous, and the students will help you understand that. So understanding your structure helps you teach better. So one of the things I really do think is that we need to be, when we practice assessment, we're actually becoming better educators. So, for example, in this situation, students are probably going to tell you this is a useless class or useless assignment. And the truth is, it doesn't actually connect to course outcomes, so they're right. A lot of this formality just helps you structure that so that you understand. On the other end, some assignments might actually be too much. In this example, we've got an assignment with a whole bunch of course outcomes tied to it. That's a pretty big assignment. One of the easiest ways to do this is actually to create grids and structures that will allow you to know what is working and what's not working without guessing or estimating, as some people do. So this is the part I love. I love creating course competency grids. If you've never seen a course competency grid before, essentially you've got I like to do courses across the X and program outcomes across the Y. You don't have to worry yourself right now with the specific program outcomes, but this is an actual course grid for an MS that I created. And I also like to prioritize, so certain outcomes are a high priority for a class, others are a low priority, and some are not required at all. And then I like to sort them in sequence so you can actually see the progression and understand where students are learning specific activity or learning specific outcomes and how they're performing. So this is a functional degree. So this is a degree as we first launched it. And if you look carefully at this grid, you should be able to see that there's a big problem with the degree already. And that's this little red space in between that I'm highlighting. It's a course that is not tied to any of our program outcomes, nor is it functionally tied to what we'd hope a student would learn. And the students clearly told us about this, and inevitably we ended up removing that course. Sometimes this happens for political reasons, sometimes this happens because you need some credits from some other programs, but it's a good example and it's evident in this grid. Likewise, you can see in this grid that we've got some classes that look like they are weed out. They have very high priority outcomes across almost the entire curriculum. Now, it's perfectly appropriate for a gatekeeper course where you might be trying to figure out whether or not people are ready to matriculate, but it also could be a problem in your curriculum. You can also do things like evaluate. One of the things I like to do is, in this example, you can actually see there's a sort of a high priority course early in the curriculum with no introduction. This is the first one, but it's a very high priority. So it's easy to understand that maybe the students are going to perceive this course as a high expectation course. And you can do this with classes too. So these are program outcomes from one of the programs that I created. That's the full list. A course might just have 3 of them as its primary goal. We take those 3, they basically estimate to things like appropriately articulating game designs, understanding and emulating philosophies, and then research and evaluation. And I actually tie that to an assignment rubric. So I provide the students with this assignment rubric, and if you look at the criteria, what you'll see is that each of those core program outcomes are tied to this assignment, and they fall through in the class. You'll also notice that if the student fails to do 2 of the 3 competencies, demonstrate them, then they can't pass this pass-fail assignment. So the rubric is very clearly linked to the program. And that's what I mean by starting from the top. I think it's really useful. And obviously what it allows you to do is things like trace student performance and trace success. So you can understand why certain students are doing really well with game mechanics, and maybe other students are doing really well with writing, and you can fine-tune and adjust both your curriculum and your course to do it. And there are lots of ways to do these grids. Sometimes it's just about marking X's. Other times it's actually about ranking. So these are different degrees that I've done this for. But I think it's also important for people to recognize that they need to do this cooperatively with faculty, and you should have student critique in hand. Doing it frequently is very valuable. It reminds you. It helps everybody understand what the courses are trying to do and what the assignments are trying to do. So we've done these in workshops, for example. So I've only been at the University of Miami for about 4 or 5 months, but we did this very early because I really do love doing it. And what you can see immediately is that we had all the faculty there, and we were able to assess whether or not certain courses were working. And we can do it down to things like technologies. So we could say that we're looking at Unity, or we're looking at GameSalad and figuring out how much they're getting. So this is a game studies course, and these are the goals that we had for the course. But it also allows you to do things like say, wait a minute, this class has an awful lot in it. Maybe we need to take some stuff out in order to make sure that it delivers a quality education. And you can identify classes that may be asking too little, or that may be doing one thing so substantially, there's an opportunity to do a little more. Obviously, it also helps everyone understand how their courses fit into the grand scheme, and that's the reason I like doing it as a workshop. So people understand why they're doing the things they're doing and how it relates to the grand goal of delivering a quality education. So generally, I think that doing this kind of work helps make better assignments. It also helps map to outcomes. These will map to outcomes, and will actually make the rubrics make sense. That's all I have. Thanks for listening.
All right. So, hi, my name's Andy. I am a professor at the University of Canterbury. Wow, that's weird to say, because I haven't actually started that job yet. And also a professor at Rochester Institute of Technology. So for my little talk here, I wanted to kind of get at 2 things. One is the idea that when I grade, my role for the last 5 years, I've taught our sort of like big game production course, like make the sort of big product for the program at RIT that that folks get in a group and sort of capstone-y kind of thing. And I wanted to sort of do 2 things with that. One is to note that we really focus more on the process than the product. From a grading perspective, and also to sort of situate that in all of the things that you just described. Okay. So first, if you know me, this is sort of my mantra of games education, which is we learn by making things. So all of my stuff tends to be very project-driven, very applied, very sort of constructionist roots kind of thing. And as I just said, right, like. The grade is really never about the thing that we make, it's about the process by which we make the thing, right? Trying to evaluate somebody's engagement in that process. And I think that's important because at the end, right, we're not teaching them to make a certain thing that they are then going to go and make that thing over and over and over again, right? We're trying to give them a set of tools that they're going to use to apply to a different context every time. Because anybody that makes games will tell you, right, just because you made one doesn't mean you know how to make the next one exactly the same way, right? Every game is a little snowflake, right? That's just what games are. So in starting from the top, if you will, this is our program mission for the program at RIT. I don't expect you to read it, okay? I just thought it was interesting to note that we actually have one, because sometimes we forget. And also that I wrote it, and I don't even really remember writing it at this point. So there it is, but there is one. That maps to program goals. There are, in fact, program goals. And those program goals map to student learning outcomes, and there are a fair number of student learning outcomes. And those map to individual pieces of those learning outcomes, map to each and every course in the curriculum. That's the one for the game production course. And then those map to individual outcomes within that course. So apply current technology in a media-centric context, effectively communicate technical and design concepts through writing, speech, and formal presentation, et cetera, right? So these are the things they're actually going to do, right? And how does that map to like getting them to really, what activities do they do in the course that we then evaluate, right? So that's where you go and you make your syllabus and you figure out what they're actually going to do over the course of the semester, and then how does that map back to those things. So this was mine, right? These are the things they're actually going to do. There's going to be daily check-ins. There's going to be weekly updates. There's going to be milestone sprints. There's going to be major checkpoints, et cetera, et cetera. Probably anybody that's taught a game production style or make a game course is semi-familiar with this kind of thing. It's not, I don't think, particularly avant-garde. But again, a focus on process, right? And so like these are some screens from the kind of work that would happen in that course. We made a game over the last few years called Fragile Equilibrium. You should all go play it. It's now on Xbox, yay. Thank you, panelists, right? But again, right, so really focusing on how is the work being done, not just the work, right? And so when I map that into the course, right, so here's the big scary thing at the beginning, right, is this is a course about making games. So in the end, the fact that you're making a game means that that's kind of the primary activity that we're going to get graded on. So there's your big 70%. And I'll talk about that, why that's not so scary in a minute. And then also some peer assessment and also, God forbid, actual documentation. I know, right? So strange. And that 70% is really interesting because, of course, we have a big discussion on the very first day about that totally freaks people out, right? And they're like, I can go the whole semester and then I don't know how I'm doing and I'm going to fail and blah, 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 right? No, you can't, right? So the very first thing we do is we have a big discussion about the fact that critique is about work and not about the person, which is a really hard lesson, particularly for undergraduates, but nonetheless. And then we start giving them feedback on their work in the first week. And then we do it again in the second week. We do it again in the third week. And every single week, we crit the game. Mm-hmm. Right? And so that's the iterative process by which I'm teaching production. And then after a while, they don't want to listen to my feedback anymore. Or I become too nice. So occasionally, I will use school children to give them feedback. Because school children have no filter, and they will happily tell you that your game sucks. Right? Straight to your face. So 8-year-olds, dude. There you go. And so, yeah. And then we also did things like I invited the university president to come to class and play our game. So that sort of freaked him out a little bit, right? We would sponsor play dates and pizza sessions for other students in the program to come in and like all that kind of stuff, but always iteratively. And so you get to week 16, right? They know what grade they're going to get. I don't have to grade it at that point, right? Like they've had so much feedback about their game. That kind of, that's the afterthought almost. Also, the tools that we're using make it really easy to monitor somebody's engagement in that process, right? So everybody's on Slack, everybody's in the Git, everybody's on the Google Drive, et cetera, and there's records to all of that stuff, right? So you know the person that's like not going to do anything for 3 weeks and then try to pick it up at midterms and put it back together and so on and so forth. So the big problems that we're trying to solve in that course, right, it's really a course about communication, by and large, right? It's not really just about the skills to make a game. It's really a course about professionalizing that context and learning to work in a team. Formal and informal learning, cultural and dev capability, academic immersion, et cetera. Like I said, we did this whole big game, and everybody was really happy with it, and we put it on Xbox and blah, blah, and there was much celebrating, and yay. Here's the thing. What this really means, because it's about process, it means that you can make a great game, and if you made it the worst possible way, you can fail, right? Because you didn't really learn what you were supposed to learn out of that experience at all, right? I've watched some big studios make games in a really horrible way. Just saying. So you can also maybe not make the final product that you want to make, right? But you learned that process, and you can carry it forward and use it again, in which case you really did meet the goals and objectives in what you were supposed to get out of that course, right? When I was running the Magic Center, we also did postmortems for every single course, for every production course, for every project, all of which tied back to not just their grades and their portfolio piece for the project, but more importantly, it tied back to figuring out where our curriculum was working and where it wasn't. And so we would do meta review around the curriculum and say, if everybody failed this course, it's probably not just that everybody failed the course. Maybe there's something wrong with the course, right? Or if everybody got an A in this course, but then they go to the next course and they don't know how to do the thing they just got an A in, maybe we want to look at that kind of thing, right? So all of that I put together for all of the courses in the program at RIT, all of the documentation for all of the degrees themselves, all of the mappings between the learning objectives and the outcomes and the institutional general education requirements and all that kind of stuff is all on my website, and it's all free, and it can all be yours for the price of nothing. All right? And that's new. I've been working very hard to sort of get all that stuff packaged up and put out there. The original degree was 2006, and then we redid them all because we moved to semesters in 2013. Good times. Take it, use it, make yours better, etc. And that's my talk.
Hi, I'm Roger. I'm from the University of Utah and Queensland University of Technology, where I'm a senior research faculty member this year. And both schools were kind enough to let me take off work and be here with you today, so I appreciate their support a lot. I have a bunch of other titles, and that's because you can get them online pretty cheap. My Twitter is on there, and my email is on there, and you can feel free to make fun of me both places. And if you want to take pictures of me and put them on Twitter, I'm all about that. So you feel free. I know that's not everyone's social media policy. It's an important thing to respect, but I'm vain. All right. Like Lindsay, I've done some things. We've all done some things. Utah gave me an award for doing things, which was great because it let you skip the line at graduation and go right to the front, and that's how you know it's a good award, right? I think that shows it. I've helped students do a bunch of things over the years, and I actually talk about this only because it looks like teaching, right? So when we talk about teaching, we frequently focus only on the classroom experience, but in a lot of our games programs, we do a lot with extracurriculars and with career readiness, or with just being a good global citizen. So there are all sorts of ways that people engage with all sorts of other communities outside the classroom, and we do teach to those things. Jose Zagal is going to be giving a speech this afternoon on extracurricular activities that game programs do. You should definitely go to that and give him big ups on the votes. But we've done lots of things that don't just look like classroom things. Clearly, I'm on a diet and was thinking about that when I made these slides. But when we first started EAE, we really focused on splitting things into thirds, right? So we wanted to have a variety of experiences across the curriculum, and those all have to be assessed very differently. And so a third of our classes were the classes we know and love, taught by faculty members, good learning outcomes, all of that kind of stuff. A third of our classes were the project-based classes like Andy described. We actually stole a bunch of stuff from Andy before he made it public, so we actually don't have to credit him because there was no way to cite it back then. But y'all are hosed. You have to cite it now. He we got smart. But a third of our classes were actually taught by industry professionals. And I want to talk about that for a couple of seconds. It was awesome. Right? So we were lucky enough to have at our disposal lots of people in our community who were actively involved in the process of making games, both at the indie and the professional, well, not indie is professional, indie and AAA level, as well as Games for Health and Games for Museums. There were just a lot of people making games in Salt Lake, and so it worked out really well for us. Students loved them. Absolutely loved them because they were doing real things, right? So all of that talk about that. But more importantly, they did all sorts of bonus stuff for us. They were generous with their time and their networks. Lots of our students have gotten jobs because of our industry instructors. They sort of could model what a professional looks like. Some of us who are academics, we have businesses on the side where we make games, or we have past lives where we were developers, but we've really kind of socialized into academia and become academics, become scholars, as it were. At least we say that in our annual reviews. But that isn't exactly what a lot of these students want to do with their lives. They don't all want to become scholars. And so modeling that for them becomes important, and people actively involved in the games industry at large were great for that. They also highly boost the credibility of your program. There are different ratings out there that actually care about how many years of industry experience are in your program, right? And oddly enough, even the most academic people in our university were always talking about, oh, it's just so wonderful that you have all these years of experience. And we'd be honest, we'd say, those aren't our years of experience, right? That's the combined years of experience of all of these industry adjuncts that we have. And then there's all sorts of content that becomes very difficult to teach in the classroom, and we make all sorts of reasons about why we don't teach it. We don't teach hard skills because of insert reasons about hard skills. The one thing we don't want to talk about is that frequently we can't, right? Like, I can't teach optimization for the PS4. Right? I just can't, right? There are all sorts of things I can't teach. On the hard skill side, I can teach concepts, I can teach theory around it, I can teach rules around it, and all of those things are important. But I think it's also okay to say the real role of an adjunct isn't to abuse someone to get a sessional academic that you can pay a low rate and take advantage of them, right? It's to find someone with specialized knowledge that does something special for you and adjunct them to your faculty to fill a specific need, right? And we were able to do that, luckily. We had tons of problems with this, though. And this is actually true of a lot of people in a lot of programs who've said, our sessional academics, our industry adjuncts, because they were never trained as a professor, frequently there's all sorts of problems with the classes. Things like we had a professor who would let people turn in anything at any time, even up to a year after the class, right? And the reason was because they cared about the quality of the work, not the schedule. I'm not a schedule guy, I'm a quality guy, right? And you're going, I get it, but we got to grade this, right? Totally inconsistent assessments. Like, some people would give all A's every class, and they would, because they were so taken with the brilliance of the students, they would say that, oh my gosh, these kids are so bright, there's no way they're not all going to be awesome, everyone gets an A, right? And then we'd have people on the other side of it, and you can tell this is mostly about personality, man, everyone is dumb, everyone gets an F, right? And it was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. And then the instructors themselves had lots of anxiety and stress about, am I fitting in to the way a university teaches courses? I've heard about pedagogy. I'm really stressed out about it. So there's all sorts of anxiety about performing the classroom. So we made this industry experience program. Cotton candy has nothing to do with any of this. It's sort of grounded in this notion of socialization that happens in a lot of professional programs, especially med school. And for those of you who've never worked with a med school, if you've seen Grey's Anatomy, especially the early years, they're residents, right? So they're doctors working in a hospital, but they have to have someone with them because they're learning on the job kind of thing. So these residency kinds of models. So we took this idea of socialization, like how did we all learn to become professors? We had advisors, right? And so we got advice. We said, let's give them that role, right? And so we sort of came up with a teaching philosophy for them. We gave them a different kind of rubric to use, and then we made a workshop to onboard our industry academics into this. So we came up with socialization sort of like as a pseudo teaching philosophy for them. And we said things like, look, there's no class on how to be a professor. We learned from our advisors. And so what we want is for you to do that for these students, rather than offer a class on how to be an industry professional. In every class, whether it was game art, game engineering, game production, it didn't matter. We want you to sort of model and be with people in an authentic manner, right? To socialize them into the profession. And so rather than worrying about being a professor and are you a good professor and is that working out for you, don't worry about it. Be you. Be the industry professional that you are today and show up as that authentic person. And if you do that, there's almost no way for them to fail. It's less about your teaching and more about their learning, right? And that becomes important at graduate school level. It's, can we model things for them to learn and worry a little bit less about direct instruction at times? Not that direct instruction isn't important, but of course there's a time and place for everything. And so assessment then becomes a teachable moment in that kind of system. We say, listen, instead of worrying about creating a grading system that all makes sense and everything's weighted properly and all the things that we worry about, let's instead have you sit down twice a semester with each student and have a personal one-on-one review with them. And you can make that review about anything so long as it's true and authentic within your community and your experience. So we're asking them to sort of do a review of the student in the way that you would review a colleague or an employee, right? And so you ask yourself a simple question. Don't worry about grades for a minute, but ask yourself, given what's happened in this class with this student, would you promote them? Would you retain them? Would you be putting them on probation, or would you terminate them? And there's all sorts of reasons for these things to happen. They can be for toxic behavior. Someone was a wonderful producer, but their behavior in class was so toxic that nobody wanted to work with them, and so we would end up terminating you. It doesn't matter how good your Gantt charts are if nobody wants to work with you and or you're violating HR, right? And so you can have that conversation with somebody, and it really does help students situate this learning and synthesize this learning into their environments. Or you can tell someone, hey, you haven't turned in anything. You're great, I think you're wonderful, but you've got to turn something in. So I'm going to put you on probation, even though you've turned nothing in, but you've got to get some work done, right? So you can coach them on soft skills as well as hard skills. So you can actually look deeply at the hard skills in that manner too. And it's all up to that industry instructor. And so we sort of gave them this rubric, right, that says, hey, at the end of the semester, we'll translate this into grades for you. These grades obviously are artificially inflated because it's grad school. If you get a C, it doesn't count towards your program of study. So a C is an F, right, in grad school, so it doesn't matter, or an E, depending on the program that you're in. All right, so takeaways on this. It was really well received by our industry adjuncts. Students really liked it. Really hard to maintain across a program. And the reason for that is because it's not how things are normally done. So if you don't have a curriculum chair or a chair of the department who sort of says, this is the way we're going to do it, these kinds of systems can erode pretty quickly. So you have to work to maintain buy-in. This personal assessment led to personalized education. Students talked about how having a dynamic conversation about their progress was so meaningful to them and helped them understand more. Because when they get a letter grade, you're translating their work into a letter grade, and then they have to sort of reverse engineer how they got that grade, right? So we skip that step. You get to talk to somebody about why you're being evaluated the way that you're being evaluated. And then again, it's a focus on opportunities for learners and sort of pays homage to mentoring, coaching, and teaching. I am over time. They were under time. I stole their time. Thank you very much.
Okay, I made the critical error of choosing to go after Roger. So please be patient. I'm Mia Consalvo. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Game Studies and Design at Concordia University up in Montreal. I should hit start on my own timer. And I teach mostly game studies courses and media studies courses. I'm in a communication studies department. And so my background in terms of teaching has largely been, those humanities-focused classes. And I used to get like the big stack of literal papers. Now they're just digital attachments to emails. But if you recall, you'd have these papers and I'd grade them and like I'd do the pile thing of like these are the A's and the B's and the C's and maybe there's a D and there's usually no F's because they didn't turn anything in. And then they like became like sub-files of like the A minuses and the B pluses. And then there was the paper sitting between them, because I wasn't really sure if it was an A minus or a B plus. And you're like, but they're really good in class and they say good things, right? So this is what I think about in terms of like grading from my own perspective, and I'm just gonna like toss all of this stuff aside because for me as an academic, grading, it's a big part of my job. It's a big part of what I do and like how I think about my work. And just to provide a little levity here, when I was researching for this talk, this is a lovely quote from 1945 I found. If I were asked to enumerate 10 educational stupidities, the giving of grades would be at the top of the list. And then this even better one from 1957, a grade can be regarded only as an inadequate report of an inaccurate judgment by a biased and variable judge of the extent to which a student has attained an undefined level of mastery of an unknown proportion of an indefinite amount of material, right? Awesome. And sometimes, you feel that way at the end of the day after grading those 50 papers. You're like, I don't really know anymore. And we teach because we want to, help students learn. And we do like to give assessment and feedback. But at the end of the day, for most universities, there is an actual grade, right? A letter, a number, some kind of score that you have to give because it's your job. And there's that spreadsheet and you have to turn it in, right? And there's just all of this work that goes behind what you're thinking in terms of how am I gonna do this? And I was thinking about my personal reflections, beyond an assessment, a step-by-step process, what are the reasons I have for giving grades? There are sort of these unspoken assumptions we have. Am I rewarding a job well done? Either, it's a great paper or they gave an awesome presentation. Sometimes we think in terms of punishing, this work was so late, I have to mark it down. Sometimes, we're trying to send a message to the person hey, wise up, you haven't been doing your work. It would be nice if you turned something in. And so, part of this is bound up in the context that we have where we grade. And so we're not all coming from the same places. Every university, every state or province, every country has its own particular way of doing things. In Canada, there's a really different college and university system. With Quebec, there's a CEGEP system, which is kind of like a junior college, which shapes the students that we get. My own university is a large public university. I'm within a Department of Communication Studies, as I said, and I'm largely teaching graduate students. And as Roger mentioned, the C is really an F, although you can give an F, and as I learned, if you give a graduate student an F, they're automatically withdrawn from the program. Yeah. You should look those things up, yeah. Check your university policies. So, what's your own grading persona? How do you approach it? Those questions that I asked, and how do you see your role? Are you the Snape? Are you the McGonagall? Are you the Robin Williams jumping on the desk? We all like to think, we're inspiring the passion for learning. A couple more practical questions, I've had this debate with other colleagues where, do you start from the top in terms of kind of everybody or every assignment starts from an A and you're slowly chipping away at the things that they do wrong or that they didn't do? Other people start from the zero, right? This student gets nothing, and then for everything that they add, I will, slowly add to the score. And there's no right or wrong answer, but I think it's about just taking the time to think for yourself about how you are approaching these issues. Because if somebody is trying to tell you a certain way to do things and it's causing you problems, making you feel uncomfortable, it's because you have a different worldview. You have a different approach to how you're thinking about grades and grading. So what are some of the things that I look for in grading, other than specific learning objectives within a course? I think failure is awesome. I love papers, projects that failed in some way. Some of the best writing I've seen has embraced a particular failure, and I'm just going to talk briefly about 3 examples that I've seen over the years. So the first was a graduate student. I was just his external examiner. He was in theater, and he wanted to put on a play in World of Warcraft. And his supervisor was like, I've heard of Mia. She teaches games. She's that games person, so you should go talk to her, to see if this is a good idea. And he sat down with me and he said, yeah, so I'm going to, find a group and we're going to, just in a regular server on World of Warcraft, I'm going to, go around shouting in like the common areas and find people. We'll write a play together. We'll, cast it, we'll perform it, and it'll be awesome. And I said, oh, okay, so you're going somewhere where people know you? He's like, no, I'm going to be, like a stranger so that they don't have any past biases about me. I'm like, okay. And I said, are you going to recruit using forums for a wider reach? He's like, no, it has to be authentic and within the game. And like slowly I'm asking him these questions, and he was setting himself up for the biggest failure ever. And I could not talk him out of it, so I said, good luck. And a year later, I got the thesis, which was the most spectacular failure ever, but the thesis was amazingly good because he learned about what it is to have social capital and actual capital and to spread your message and like trust and community and all those things that you actually need to put on a theater production. He learned the hard way. The second example is I had graduate students. This is during the time when Facebook games were really huge, social games. And I said, you're all going to play social games on Facebook. You're going to play in groups together to see if this is actually a meaningful social experience. And they all groped, and they groaned, and they just grimaced, and they're like, I don't want to do it. Facebook games are dumb. And they said, I don't want to play on my real account. I don't want my friends to know that I play Facebook games. And I'm like, okay, you can create a persona if you want to. And so they did that. And this one student, his group played Gardens of Time, among others, and he loved the game. He ended up loving it. He didn't think he would. And his paper was about this marvelous failure because as soon as the assignment ended, his friends all stopped playing the game. And if you remember, these games, you need friends in order to like get resources. And he was addicted to the game by this time. So he ended up creating all kinds of fake accounts to send himself things. And, but it was still a lonely experience. But it was all about, what happens when you're playing a social game with nobody else. And then the final example is I had undergraduates play a game and critique it as part of a game analysis exercise. And I had a fair number of students who were either casual players or some that hadn't played in years. And I said to all the class, you're allowed to cheat when you play this game. And by cheat, I mean you can look things up. You could, you probably won't know how to use a hack, but you could have a friend play through a difficult part. The only thing is, when you write the paper, you have to talk about that, what you had them do, or what you did, how that made you feel, how that impacted the play experience. And those papers were some of the best that I read because it was about how some students felt, they were confronting, what they felt was an inadequacy, or they felt like they were unsure of what to do, so they looked up what was the most optimal thing. They got addicted to the walkthrough, and they said, even though I was losing the joy of making the choices myself, I felt like I couldn't stray, and that just drained away that sense of achievement that games give me. So, I think sometimes you can't tell when something's going to fail, but you can have people write about the process. And sometimes you can build in for the potential for failure because failure does things, right? It shows us where theory and practice fall apart or, where theory is really important. Failure exposes the limits of certain platforms like those Facebook games. They're just not as much fun to play by yourself. And failure can zoom in on our own limitations, right? Or potentially the limitations of, the game or the book or whatever it is that you're critiquing. So I would say don't sweep, failure under the rug. Another thing I've done is I've had groups for group projects put up a plan before they enact their project for failure. What will happen if one of your group members disappears suddenly? What happens if the technology you're going to use suddenly, is unavailable so that they're forced to confront it in advance? So, failure really gets at those gaps, those assumptions, and those shortcomings, and I think embracing that failure makes for a better paper or project. Thank you very much. So the goal was to leave plenty of time for questions, which we have now. So we can't see you, but please come up to the microphone that's over there, and we will answer your questions as best we can.
And
The best question that's a question and not a speech gets a bag of kangaroo jerky from Australia. So, incentivizing.
I don't know if I can deal with this pressure.
All right. Go for it.
So my name's Brian. I'm a high school teacher from California, teaching game development. And I was wondering, when you're setting up this idea of grading the process, not the product, do you like rubric that, or do you have like a checklist of like, oh, during this step of development, they're doing this, this, and this, or they're using these forms of communication? How are you organizing that if, for example, a department head came down on you to say, oh, how are you grading that?
I think that's directed at me. Yeah. So first is I cheated because I used to be the department head.
That's a good method.
So there's that. But more formally, we structure communication really tightly, right? And so we're using particular platforms and communication metrics. So like there was an expectation. We required the students to join the Slack and to check the Slack at least every single day. We also required that they set quiet hours. And we required that they that they like basically touch the code every day, or touch touch the art, whatever their role was. So we wanted them to touch it every day, and we wanted to model a process that was not focused around a crunch model, right? And so we were trying to get them to plan forward in what they were going to do. So we would basically kind of use an agile methodology to stretch that over time. And have a whole bunch of discussion around what we were trying to do and why we were trying to do it. The other thing we were doing in that class was we were creating little professionalized roles. So somebody was going to be the team lead for platform engineering. Somebody was going to be, the certain QA. Somebody was going to this, that, and the other. And then examining the communication between those roles, right? And getting them to document that kind of communication, right?
And
then
is this
evaluating.
something that you would set up as the instructor, or is this something you'd expect your student groups to sort of self-manage and
We kind of did it
deliberate?
together.
Okay.
Right? Because they haven't done it before.
Yeah.
So it was a sort of a guided process, if you will, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Chris Hartz. My doctorate's in game-based learning, and I've been a PM on over $500 million of that, mostly for the military and intelligence services. A few years ago, Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari, asked me if he ought to invest a few million in K-16 K-12 educational games, and I told him to save his money because there was almost no classes or games to train the trainers, to train the teachers, to do things such as grading that you've been talking about, how to fit them into 45 minutes, how to do grading, how to use games to train others. Have you guys got any thoughts on how to promote that kind of game, that kind of skill?
So I understand your question. Are you asking us how do you teach trainers to do evaluation?
Yeah. How are there schools or are there games to teach T3, train the teachers?
Oh yeah, sure. There's lots of material out there on teacher training, and so lots of universities have things called like centers for teaching and learning excellence, and so they have a lot of great research and materials and coaches that will help that. Like my talk was on that exact thing, right? I had a slew of industry professionals that had no training in evaluation, and so we pivoted and just made a system that played to their strengths, right? So you can do it on both levels. You can either say, how do we create a system of evaluation that meets the known knowledge and skills of the person doing the evaluation, or how do we provide them training? And I think there's actually quite a bit of training out there.
So we did work when I was a director of American University's program for ETS. Some of that work is under NDA, but essentially there are multiple entities that are developing software that is playful, sort of games, that are about helping people understand how to be more effective at whatever teaching challenges they have. And the idea is to substitute for a more traditional education and easily distribute it.
Thank you. Grade school teachers desperately need this because right now they're scared as hell of using video games to teach with. So
I think a lot of people are scared of help.
Hey, I'm Ryan from Georgia Tech, and I'm actually working in K-12 education, so CS education, but kind of using video games as an exciting way to teach CS. And I'm often reminded of my own experiences as a student undergrad, taking game development courses, and basically the grading of the assignments would be pretty subjective, you know, and the grading was meant to give you feedback on the process. But of course, when you're in college, it's like you have to maintain your GPA, or else you're going to put up with years of crippling debt and maybe not make it through college. And also in K-12 education, you actually usually don't have the luxury of grading the process so much. It has to be sort of a quantitative thing. So my question is what would be your advice for people in that space in K-12 to, I guess, maybe skirt the process a little bit and be able to quantify better grading the process of making the project rather than the project itself, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think there are lots of ways, right? And so in a past life, I did K through 12 education. And so I sort of understand the sort of the heavy oversight of assessment in that world, right? And so there tends to be a lot of reliance on grading projects and products, right?
Yes.
And it's real easy. You just slice the assignment into those being micro products, right? So like when I was doing online education, I would say things like, you have to ask 2 questions on Blackboard and respond to 3. So if you don't have those 6 Blackboard communication bits, you don't get it. Or you can do a peer evaluation system, which we do a lot of, which is every week you must evaluate 3 peers in your group. And then I get the double whammy, right? I get to say, did you do that peer evaluation, which is also a moment to be reflexive about yourself, but also then I get insights on those students from other perspectives than my own. And so I can know when to intervene or when to tailor things and things like that. So you turn the process into the product, and you just slice it up that way. So whether that's whatever the soft skill is or even the hard skill, you just change the unit of measurement to how many emails or how many meetings or how many presentations or how many peer reviews or whatever the things are, and then you can count all those.
Okay, so to follow up on that, and I think somebody else is going to add into it, how would you, say if you have like a PBL for, I don't know, you have to deliver in 2 weeks or a month, did you ever run into a situation where sort of grading that process was a hard sell to like your administrators or anything, and what would be the other way to, or a way to overcome that?
As long as you have things to count in a rubric, they're fine. Like, to be honest, everyone is too busy. So the minute you show up with charts and multiple pages of justification, and it looks like you're doing the work, they have more problems than you.
Got it.
Right? You're the easy one. So you go be persnickety, and they're happy, right? And they leave you alone. The appearance of persnickety saves you from so much stuff.
To embellish on what Roger was saying, I think one of the really great things in this situation is because you've sliced things up into little bits, it's actually going to make your grading so much simpler. So we can talk about the non-subjective nature of being able to say, oh, I have 6 things that I've talked about. I've done my 3 peer reviews, but it's also super useful because it helps the students cross-pollinate so that students aren't grading, like with peer evaluation in particular, students aren't understanding a grade as being offered from above, and instead they start to go, oh yeah, I see, my game design document wasn't nearly as strong as my peers. It's not a problem with the instructor, it's actually an educational moment.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Hi. 2 quick questions. One, do you have your rubrics posted online that we could take a look at for your various courses? And 2, may I please have the kangaroo jerky?
That's pretty good. It was brief. It was pretty good.
Direct, clear question.
Andy does.
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah.
Right. I have as much up there as I've been able to get up there, because I'm on my first sabbatical ever this year. After 20 years, I was like, hey, sabbatical sounds good. So I've been trying to get that up there. So that is online, and take it, use it, run with it, etc. There are actually, if you go digging, there's a lot of folks that, like Eric Zimmerman was in a talk just like I think in the morning yesterday, right? And has whatever little thing I have online is like crushed by the titanic weight of what Eric will put, out there, right? So, I mean, there are materials out there if you go spelunking for them.
All of my materials from Illinois Institute of Art when I taught there 5 years, Miami University, and some of the AU stuff are just at professorgrace.com. And I actually have every assignment, and because my course management system was actually public and before Blackboard, and I just left it all out there. I wrote my own. So.
And I just say that for rubrics, you're probably going to end up tweaking them anyway. Like, and there's tons of even general ones. I've used some for class presentations because nothing is ever quite, your specific assignment or your specific class or your particular set of students or the right level or whatever. So, it's usually the case that you might end up picking and grabbing from 3 or 4 different ones and then still, shifting it around a little bit.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would also put up, it's about the time that one of us got in trouble. So I'll just kind of throw this out there. I've been thinking about the last couple of questions and about rubrics and all that kind of stuff. And there's this sort of tiptoe dance around subjectivity that happens in a lot of this stuff. And, I'll just be frank, right? Like, my first love and my first experience with academics is I went to art school. And there's a fair amount of subjectivity in art school. And I find it really fascinating that a number of our students are really squeamish around this notion that they're going to be subjectively graded around work. And I'm like, yeah, but you want to go work in an audience-driven media entertainment landscape. So I'm confused, right? And so really professionalizing that context, right? And helping them gain some comfort with the fact that their work is going to ultimately be, subjectively evaluated by an audience. That's what that means, right? And so it's our job to help them understand what that means and how to deal with it. And so, I'm always a little fearful in kind of the rote mechanics of sometimes higher ed sort of wants to sort of, make everything so egalitarian. That they sometimes forget that there is and needs to be this subjective nature sometimes in the evaluation of work.
Is there still time for another question?
7 minutes? Cool. Yep.
I'm Darren Lloyd-Gent. I'm from the University of Greenwich in London. Kind of a question on designing curriculum for which is appropriate for higher education while still catering for industry. So I'm going to try not to kind of rant about this point because it is an axe I grind quite often, but I find that not all games companies, but a lot of them have an expectation that a student has been kind of given all of the tool sets that they need to do absolutely everything, and then quite often put into a job role where they're not using all of the skills that they've developed over the time, and especially more of the soft skills. So being able to, especially at the end of their, for me, an undergraduate 3-year program, to be able to research, to be able to evaluate and apply different concepts, methodologies, techniques, to be able to kind of test and evaluate and come to conclusions so that they're essentially kind of independent learners. And then suddenly they're kind of after, from about 30,000 to 60,000 pounds worth of debt. I don't know what that is in dollars, a bit higher maybe. That industry doesn't quite have the expectations of what academia does. So there's a twofold question. Have you had any issues with designing a curriculum which caters for academia and research and also fulfilling what industry wants?
No. Yeah, of course. But I think that with your so we do, right? So we're an R1 university that has an undergraduate liberal arts games program, but then we have a professional master's program. And I think it's important to sort of make those differentiations, right? Schools do this all the time, right? Like there are law schools that are theory focused, and there are law schools that are practice focused, right? And while there is always, it's never a binary, it's always a spectrum. They have no problem saying our job is to make working lawyers out of this law school, right? Med schools are very similar. There are lots of places. It's one of the things I think that we get wrong in tech is we kind of think that there aren't other professional programs on campus, right? And from the MFA to the MD, and everyone in between, they've assessed communities, what those requirements are. Some are more formal, some are less formal, but they understand. And so like the MDs, as an example, spent decades negotiating with industry the placement and adoption of what it takes to get an MD into a hospital, right? But in the MFAs, they can speak very closely, or very, very detailed about the culture of photography. And if you want to be a New York photographer in an art scene, they can tell you what that takes, right? And so I think that half of it is we aren't negotiating with our industry in ways that we don't want to just throw our hands up and say, I'm offended, or I don't want to train people, or whatever the problem is. That the problem from students transitioning into industry is our relationship with an industry's problem. Right? It falls upon the faculty. It's not the industry's fault that they don't understand what we're trying to build. It's not the students' fault that they aren't working hard enough. It's if we think of this thing as a professional program, and not all games programs are or should be professional programs, but if you have one that you're saying is, then you have to have a relationship with industry that allows for the migration of students back and forth through it. And it just requires constant contact and relationships. A lot of schools make that difficult. Some schools make it easy. So I think the problem tends to be we're not taking enough lessons from other more mature industry or professional programs. And they exist in everywhere, from phlebotomy to the MBA, right? They're all over the place, and we just got to adopt their techniques.
I think ultimately, from where I'm seeing my graduates going, is that they're being adopted by the serious games industry, by VR and AR. They're being paid a lot more, treated a lot better, and a lot of the games entertainment industry just aren't, or isn't kind of matching that. So I'm almost kind of shepherding my students away from the thing that they want to love doing and expect to be paid in love.
Yeah, again, go to the arts, right? Like, if somebody wants to be a poet, I'm not going to shuffle them towards tech writing because it pays better and has insurance. People have agency in life, right? And so it is our job to equip people to have the agency they want, right? And to respect that.
Cool. Thank you.
Time for one more question.
One more?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do two.
We have a wrap-up room, so.
I'll be quick. Do you guys have any ideas on grading for non-standard game departments or game courses? I do a lot of nonprofit and lower education game dev, including elementary school kids, which are really creative.
So I think one of the things that it's almost a theme that you'd see, to give you a quick answer, it's partially about slicing it up and rewarding things like process. So the idea is that you would basically create a rubric that focuses on the things that you want to be outcomes for the course. So if you're trying to encourage them to think widely outside the box, then that should be a core element, and you just need to find ways to appropriately structure that into the rubric.
Thank you.
I have excuse me. I have a question about Fred.
Fred?
About Fred. Fred. I used to have a pet kangaroo called Fred. I was caught by animal control. Fred got deported to Australia.
Happens.
I understood at first that he was at a nice kangaroo home. But it turns out to be a kangaroo meat processing plant. And I was wondering if I might have some of Fred to take home.
If you want to take Fred home with you, I think that's fine.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I think you have earned that. Anything we can do to ease your suffering, sir.
And on that note, it looks like we are out of time. We should be reminding you. Sorry, we should remind you that you should complete the evaluations. We want your feedback and invite
You get to grade us.
Yay!
Yeah, there should be like 100% assessment in this room. Right? Thank you all so much. You're awesome.